These are the final hours of 6 of history's most notorious dictators. What happened when their iron-fisted rule came to an end reveals the brutal reality that many who ruled through fear ultimately faced their own terrifying deaths. Something surprising shows up when you look at the numbers. Research analyzing 79 dictators who died in office from 1946 to 2014 found that 92% of regimes actually persist after an autocrat's death. And according to Matthew White, author of The Great Big Book of Horrible Things, 60% of oppressive warmongering dictators lived what he calls happily ever after, dying of old age or disease rather than at the hands of an enraged populace or assassin. The 6 men we're looking at today weren't part of that 60%. Their final hours tell very different stories. From suicide in underground bunkers to execution by firing squad, from mob violence to carefully orchestrated judicial hangings. And these weren't natural deaths in hospital beds surrounded by family. These were endings that matched the violence of their regimes. Perhaps the most infamous death of the 20th century belongs to Adolf Hitler, and that's where we'll start. January 16, 1945 marked the day Hitler moved permanently into the Führerbunker in Berlin, which wasn't some luxurious hideout with marble floors and chandeliers. 55 feet under the Reich Chancellery sat this bunker containing 18 rooms that were fully self-sufficient with their own water and electrical supply, but the whole structure was below the water table, which meant pumps had to run continuously just to remove the groundwater. Damp, oppressive, and increasingly claustrophobic as the walls of Nazi Germany closed in, Hitler would spend 105 days living in that concrete tomb. April 20th, 1945 brought his 56th birthday and his last trip to the surface, where he went to the ruined garden of the Reich Chancellery and awarded the Iron Cross to boy soldiers of the Hitler Youth before going back underground, never to emerge again. Events moved quickly once the end became obvious. Hitler married his longtime mistress Eva Braun in the small hours of April 28th and 29th, and they lived together as husband and wife for less than 40 hours before everything fell apart. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel delivered the death blow at 1 a.m. on April 30th when he reported that all the forces Hitler had been depending on to rescue Berlin had either been encircled or forced onto the defensive, which meant the situation was hopeless. Everyone in that bunker knew it, even if they couldn't say it out loud. Around 2:30 that morning, Hitler appeared in the corridor where about 20 people were assembled to give their farewells, went down the line shaking hands and speaking with each of them, then retired to his quarters for the last time. Suicide came that afternoon around 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, with Hitler using both a cyanide capsule and shooting himself in the head while Eva Braun took poison beside him. Staff members carried the bodies outside to the courtyard, doused them in petrol, and set them alight. But even after many hours of burning, Hitler's blackened shin bones were still visible through the flames. Dental records later identified him, and his body was buried and exhumed several times before finally being crushed into dust and tossed into the River Elbe in 1970. Just 2 days before Hitler's death, another fascist dictator met a very different end, and Benito Mussolini's story shows what happens when you can't hide underground. April 25, 1945 arrived, and the 61-year-old Mussolini knew the game was up. Allied forces were closing in from the south while anti-fascist partisans were rising up to seize city after city in northern Italy. So he fled Milan with his 33-year-old mistress Clara Petacci in a 1939 Alfa Romeo sports car he'd bought as a gift for her, hoping Switzerland would offer them refuge. Near the village of Dongo on Lake Como on April 27th, Mussolini tried something desperate by putting on a German Luftwaffe helmet and overcoat as a disguise and hiding in a German convoy heading north. But that face was too famous to hide. 2 decades of propaganda posters across Italy featuring his bald head, strong jaw, and piercing brown eyes meant that cult of personality he'd so carefully cultivated had just come back to haunt him in the worst possible way. Partisans seized Mussolini and Petacci without much of a fight, then hid the pair in a remote farmhouse for the night while they decided what to do, fearing the Nazis would attempt another rescue since they'd freed him once before in 1943. Morning came on April 28th, and they were taken to the small village of Giulino di Mezzegra, where at 4:10 p.m. they were ordered to stand in front of a stone wall at the entrance to Villa Belmonte. Mussolini died shouting, "No, no!" as the firing squad opened fire, though some accounts say his last words were actually, "Shoot me in the chest," and a bullet penetrated his left forehead and passed completely through his head, tearing out part of the skull above and behind the right ear. Violence didn't end there, though. Not even close. Pre-dawn hours of April 29th brought the corpses of Mussolini, Petacci, and 14 other fascists being dumped like garbage in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, which was deeply symbolic because 8 months earlier, fascists had publicly displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans in that exact same spot. Pure rage unleashed on a dead body came next. Milan residents hurled vegetables at the corpses, kicked them, beat them, spat on them. And one woman emptied an entire pistol into Mussolini's body while screaming, "5 shots for my 5 assassinated sons!" Bodies were then strung up by their heels from meat hooks at an Esso gas station, hanging upside down in front of a jeering crowd for everyone to see. And the dictator who had once strutted across the world stage comparing himself to Julius Caesar now dangled like a piece of meat. Fast forward 8 years to March 1953, and we find another dictator in his final hours. But Joseph Stalin's death played out very differently from the public spectacle of Mussolini. February 28, 1953, started normally enough with Stalin hosting his inner circle at his private residence, where Lavrenti Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, and Vyacheslav Molotov all drank heavily and watched movies before leaving around 5-8 a.m. on March 1st. Khrushchev later noted that Stalin had a lot to drink but was in a good mood when they finally headed home. Silence came next. March 1st passed with no sound from Stalin's private quarters, and a stopped watch found later on the floor suggested he'd collapsed at 6:30 that morning. But here's where it gets disturbing because Stalin lay there in his own urine for more than 12 hours before his staff dared to do anything about it. That delay tells you everything about what it was like to work for Stalin. Dozens of doctors had recently been arrested for treason in his paranoia, which meant his staff was absolutely terrified to call for medical help because they didn't know if helping him would somehow be seen as suspicious or traitorous. So they waited and waited while their boss lay dying on the floor. 1 a.m. on March 2nd arrived, nearly 19 hours after Stalin likely collapsed, before someone finally informed the 4 high-ranking officials about the situation. Khrushchev decided not to even look at Stalin when he arrived, claiming it was inappropriate to see him in his pajamas, while Beria looked at Stalin and told everyone to stop panicking because the dictator was just sleeping before they left after that brief visit. Hours later, they returned as Stalin remained unconscious, and only then at 7 a.m. on March 2nd were doctors finally summoned to examine him. Blood pressure of 190/110 and paralysis on his right side revealed itself during the examination, meaning Stalin had suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke involving the left middle cerebral artery. Doctors tried everything available at the time, applying 8 leeches to his neck and face in 2 separate sessions over the next 2 days, attempting to reduce his blood pressure, which had climbed to 210/120. But nothing worked. Svetlana, his daughter, was there at the end and later described his final moments in chilling detail. At the last moment, he suddenly opened his eyes, and it was a horrible look, either mad or angry and full of fear of death, she wrote. And then he suddenly raised his left hand and sort of either pointed up somewhere or shook his finger at everyone in the room before his soul, after one last effort, broke away from his body. 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953, brought Stalin's death, with the autopsy revealing a large hemorrhage that had destroyed important areas of his brain. December 1989 witnessed one of the most dramatic and most televised dictator deaths of the modern era, and that would be Nicolae Ceausescu. Romania had been under his iron fist for 24 years, but by late December 1989, as communist regimes of Eastern Europe fell like dominoes, his time had run out. Protests had erupted across Romania, and on December 22, Ceausescu and his wife Elena fled Bucharest by helicopter around noon, hoping to escape the angry crowds that wanted them dead. Chaos marked their escape from the start. Claims of anti-aircraft fire from the pilot led to a landing near a town called Gaiești, which meant the Ceausescus then had to hijack cars and force drivers at gunpoint to take them toward Târgoviște. And during one of these rides, they heard news of the revolution on the car radio. Ceausescu angrily denounced it as a coup d'etat because he simply refused to accept that his reign was actually over. But denial didn't change reality because they were taken to an agricultural center near Târgoviște, locked in an office, and arrested by soldiers around 6 p.m. on December 22nd. Revolutionary authorities faced a difficult question about what to do with the Ceausescus. Months or years of proper trials appealed to some, while others feared the situation was too volatile, that loyalists might attempt a rescue, or that the couple might become martyrs if given too much time. So they decided on a quick military tribunal that would settle things immediately. 5:30 a.m. on Christmas Day, brought Nikolai and Elena being transported by armored personnel carrier to a garrison command office where their trial would take place. Charges of genocide, armed attack on the people and state power, and destruction of state institutions covered crimes spanning their 25 years in power, during which more than 1,000 people had died in the recent crackdown on protesters, and a hastily arranged military trial proceeded despite Nikolai refusing to recognize the tribunal. Before the execution, Nikolai declared, "We could have been shot without having this masquerade," which showed he understood the trial was just for show. Two final wishes came from the couple, that they die together and that their hands not be tied, but only their first wish was granted when 4 soldiers tied their hands behind their backs despite Elena's protests and angry objections. 2:50 p.m. on Christmas Day marked when the Ceausescus were led to a wall in the courtyard of military unit UM-1417. Witnesses reported Elena screaming, "You sons of bitches," as she was led outside, while Nikolai remained relatively calmer and began singing a fragment of the Internationale, the communist anthem, before the 8-man firing squad opened fire and cut him off mid-song. Videotape captured the entire trial and execution, and the footage was released to Western countries just 2 days later before being shown on Romanian television for the world to watch. October 2011 brought us to Muammar Gaddafi, cornered in his hometown of Sirte after ruling Libya as the self-proclaimed brother leader for 42 years. Tripoli fell to opposition forces in August 2011, which sent Gaddafi fleeing to Sirte where he'd been born, and where he thought tribal loyalties might protect him. Months passed with him, and his inner circle moving between abandoned homes trying to avoid the fierce shelling by anti-Gaddafi militias who had surrounded the area and were closing in. Morning arrived on October 20, 2011, and brought a desperate decision from Gaddafi's son Mutassim, who was commanding the defense of Sirte and ordered the remaining loyalists to escape in a convoy of about 50 heavily armed vehicles. Pre-dawn darkness was supposed to cover the operation, but delays came because they had to take wounded loyalists with them, according to Human Rights Watch's investigation, and what should have been a quick escape in the dark turned into a lengthy maneuver in broad daylight when they were completely exposed. NATO spotted the large convoy from the air, and a drone fired a missile that hit and destroyed one vehicle, scattering everyone in panic. Gaddafi was already wounded from a grenade thrown by one of his own bodyguards that had exploded nearby, killing his defense minister Abu Bakr Yunus in the blast, and he was weak and exhausted because he'd eaten and drunk little in days when someone found him hiding in a drainage pipe. Cell phone video captured what happened next. Rebel fighters dragged Gaddafi out of the pipe, and the footage shows them beating him severely before someone sodomized him with a bayonet. And by the time he was being loaded into an ambulance, half naked and covered in blood, he appeared lifeless. Claims from the National Transitional Council said Gaddafi died from injuries sustained in a firefight, but the video evidence told a completely different story. International organizations reviewed the evidence and called into question the official account, suggesting Gaddafi was killed after being captured, which would make it a potential war crime. Violence didn't stop with Gaddafi either, and on the morning after the battle, at least 66 apparent execution victims were found at the nearby Mahari Hotel. Human Rights Watch visited the site on October 23rd, where they found 53 decomposing bodies still lying where they'd been killed, with evidence indicating these were captured members of Gaddafi's convoy who'd been disarmed, brought under complete control, beaten, and then executed in cold blood. December 30th, 2006 brings us to our final case, the execution of Saddam Hussein, which was supposed to be dignified but became something else entirely. U.S. forces captured Saddam on December 13, 2003, pulling him from a small underground hiding place near Tikrit, and the Iraqi Special Tribunal tried him for crimes against humanity, specifically for ordering the killing of 148 Iraqi Shiites in the town of Dujail in 1982, in retaliation for an assassination attempt against him. November 5, 2006 brought the verdict of death by hanging, but Saddam asked to be executed by firing squad instead, claiming it was the lawful military capital punishment given his former position as commander-in-chief of the Iraqi military. Denial came from the court, and hanging it would be. Appeals were rejected on December 26, leaving him just 4 days left to live. A letter from Saddam appeared on the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party website 2 days before the execution, urging the Iraqi people to unite and saying he was ready to die as a martyr and that he was at peace with his death sentence. Morning came on December 30th and brought his last meal, which was chicken and rice with a cup of hot water with honey, simple food for a man who once lived in palaces. Approximately 6:05 a.m. local time at a place called Camp Justice, an Iraqi army base in a neighborhood of northeast Baghdad, marked when the execution was carried out, and it happened on the first day of Eid al-Adha, one of Islam's most important holidays, which sparked controversy and condemnation from several Islamic countries, including Saudi Arabia. Saddam stood on the gallows with the noose around his neck and began reciting his final Muslim prayers, saying, "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I testify that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah," when someone in the crowd shouted, "The tyrant has collapsed," and Saddam responded, "May God's blessings be upon Muhammad and his household." Reciting the Shahada for the second time, the trapdoor opened and cut him off mid-sentence, and the rope broke his neck, killing him instantly. Official video from the Iraqi government ended after the noose was placed over Saddam's head, but an unofficial video taken on a mobile phone showed the full execution and revealed something the government didn't want the world to see. Saddam being jeered by his executioners, who taunted him in Arabic and praised the Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, appeared in the recording, turning what should have been a solemn execution into a sectarian revenge killing. International controversy sparked when this leaked video went viral. U.S. President George W. Bush said he wished the execution had gone on in a more dignified way, and later stated it looked like it was kind of a revenge killing, which was exactly what it turned out to be. What do these 6 deaths tell us about how dictators meet their end and what patterns emerge? Statistics from the beginning reveal something when you really look at them. While 60% of dictators do die of natural causes, those who ruled through the most extreme violence often faced violent ends themselves. But even in those violent deaths, there's a pattern that might surprise you, because coups and public revolts following a dictator's death are actually rare. During the year of a leader's death, coups occurred in only 6% of cases compared to 32% when autocrats left power by other means, which shows death itself doesn't automatically spark revolution. Hitler chose suicide rather than face capture and trial. Mussolini tried to escape, but was caught, executed, and humiliated in death before being strung up like meat for crowds to spit on. Stalin died after his subordinates were too terrified to get him medical help in time, lying helpless for days. Christmas Day brought the Ceausescu's being captured, given a show trial, and shot within hours. Gaddafi was dragged from a drainage pipe and killed by a mob that beat and sodomized him on camera. Saddam was hanged after a trial, but the execution became exactly the kind of sectarian revenge his regime had been known for. Fear, violence, and the cult of their own personality marked how each of these men ruled. Research shows that 92% of authoritarian regimes survive after their dictator dies, which proves that these men, despite their delusions of grandeur, were ultimately replaceable, and the systems they built often outlasted them by decades. Their deaths, though, captured in testimonies, videos, and photographs, serve as permanent reminders that absolute power has its limits, and those who live by violence often die by it. These were the final hours of 6 dictators who learned that no amount of power can ultimately protect you from the consequences of how you wielded it. Thanks for watching. Catch you on the next one.